Bringing you back in time. Some of you are a little too young to understand that experience, although some of you are a little older, which is just fine, where you were perhaps my age when that song came out, which is just fine. Just fine. What also is just fine that you're here talking with me or listening to the show again today. Thank you all so much for joining me on UFO Think Tank Radio. And I want to thank all of the new listeners, because we keep getting all these new listeners, which is just fabulous. I hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you stick with me, because, you know, the show has been going now for over 3 or 4 years, and we rarely have repeat guests, even though I tell a lot of these guests, hey, you're great, and I need to have you back. And it's not that I don't mean it. For the most part, 90% of the time, I really mean it. And it's just I haven't gotten around to getting back with those people, but we will down the road. There's just so many people out there doing some really great stuff, and that I'm really excited to talk to, including our guest today, who is Scott Roberts. Now, Scott is an author, and he is also publishing the magazine Intrepid Mag. You may be aware of that. You may not. We had on Micah Hanks not too long ago. He actually writes for this magazine, along with many others. Nick Redfern, I think we've had him on the show. We definitely had him on the show, but he writes for the magazine. It's a digital magazine, and one thing that has always struck me is that it's beautiful. It looks great. The graphics are really cool, much like OpenMinds magazine has really cool graphics. And Scott Roberts, as I understand, is an illustrator, so he's the one who does these wonderful graphics for his magazine. So I wanted to talk to him a little bit about the magazine. Honestly, I just interviewed him a little while ago, and so I'll play it in a minute here. But we really didn't get around too much to the magazine. Instead, we talked a lot about his books, because he's also an author, and a couple of those books are let me get the titles right, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and the other book is The Secret History of the Reptilians. And why is this exciting? Some of you love this stuff. Some of you, just when I mentioned Nephilim and reptilians, you're getting all excited, and you're buzzing, and you're like, oh, this is going to be great, which is cool. Some of you already know where we're headed here. And, well, Scott, this is what's interesting about him and how he came to write about these topics. He was actually a student in Bible school, essentially, and in seminary when he started to ask questions about the Bible. You know, well, it says this. Does it mean that? Does it mean this or that or who to what? And I think we all had that experience. And so he started to also identify that just like other ancient folklore, just like, you know, some of you are familiar with Zechariah Sitchin's work or with the Greek gods or with other mythologies, there's a lot of similarities. So he started to speculate, okay, all of these ancient cultures and their ancient mythologies are saying that these gods are coming from the heavens and they're hooking up with our hotties down here, and there's these hybrid children, and they're making mankind, or they're enslaving mankind in some cases. What's going on here? Why are they all similar? He begins to speculate maybe there's a trend or something going on here. So that's what we're talking with Robert about. And really we're talking, which I think is very interesting, about the whole topic of belief and why people believe what they believe, and how he made this transition, and he started questioning his own beliefs and wondering why that wasn't okay. Why is it not okay to kind of converse about the different possibilities? And so it's a very, very interesting talk, I think. And so I'm really happy to have Scott Roberts on the show, and we'll be talking to him in just a minute. A couple things first. One thing before I get to the news, and our interview is really long, so I better hurry it up. But is that the Cosmic Exploration Conference has been canceled, or you could say postponed, really because, one of many reasons, but this is pretty cool. MUFON, as you know, I've become the MUFON Director of Public Relations, and there's a new YouTube, the YouTube I created a long time ago, but MUFON HQ is a YouTube. There's @MUFON is a Twitter. As you know, I'm a Twitter guy, a tweeter. And then there's Facebook, which is facebook.com/Mutual UFO Network. So go there, post stuff. If you got stuff to post, cool stories you see, maybe you got a MUFON meeting you're holding, or another group and you want to post some stuff, come talk to us, come see us on the Facebook, and come check out our Twitter, and we'll socialize online. It'll be beautiful. It's going to be great. See you there. But MUFON is also like the idea of my conference and has asked me to help them with their next conference. So we're going to do the MUFON Symposium in Vegas, and you're going to see some of those speakers that I was going to have there. So we're kind of just postponing it in a way. And if you go to the Cosmic Exploration site, you'll see that notice posted there. So that's what's going on with that. I've already communicated with all the speakers and the people who had registered thus far. For those of you who had registered, thank you so very much. You are beautiful, wonderful people. My listeners are beautiful and wonderful, but these guys are just a little bit, try a little harder, you'll get there, though. Anyways, some of the stories that are out there, the big story this week, there's not really any real big story. The big one posted by Lee Spiegel, because, of course, he's the guy, Mr. Spiegel. On the Huffington Post, he posted something about a UFO buzzing a helicopter in Ireland, and he shows a video. And then he also actually shows a couple other interesting videos. However, there are some questions about this video. He's saying stuff like, why does the title claim it was within a few feet of a police helicopter? Do we know it was a police helicopter? Do we even know it's in Ireland? And these are good questions because, as we know in the past, just because someone says, hey, this is a UFO video in such and such place, and this is what happened, often those facts do not come out to be true. And we find out that we have either been deceived or there's a mistake. Who knows what the deal was. But so we're looking more into this, but he posted these videos because it's just kind of fun, interesting stuff. Also, Noe Torres, who we've had on the show, he and his buddy Ruben Uriarte, they're kind of partners and written some books together. In fact, we interviewed them not too long ago about their latest book, the interesting events in California that Mr. Shrum, I remember his name, had. But Noe Torres lives in Texas, and they had a little conference out there, and they made the news. So ValleyCentral.com has a little interview with Noe Torres, and they're talking about his research and a conference, a small conference that they had out there. So in Edinburgh, it was called the Edinburgh UFO Conference. That sounds like it's in the UK, but it's not. It's actually Texas. Interesting. Hey? Fox News put up a story about a UFO spotted over the Antarctica, and Fox News is, I think the story is, they got it from Live Science. The picture is obviously a balloon, and they're trying to say, look, UFO people are boneheads because they can't tell this is a balloon. But you know what, Mr. Fox News, you didn't get this story from the UFO people. We're not talking about that. You're just pulling stuff out of your you-know-what, and that's disgusting. So, but Fox News, at least they're writing about UFOs, something, of course, they're making fun of it. But I just wanted to let you know about that story. NASA's also spoken a little fun, but actually this is kind of fun. They did release in their image of the day. You are probably familiar, those of you who are space fans, that NASA has images of the day where they post some spectacular images from astronomers and others related to space. And this is a graphic they got off of Facebook of NASA's first major curiosity discovery, and it's kind of funny. It shows a couple aliens, like from the Aliens movies, and they're holding up a picture of some dirt and a boring horizon, and they're holding it in front of the rover. Meanwhile, behind them, there's this elaborate alien city landscape that they're hiding. So it's kind of fun. I got to say that. You can check that out. And finally, speaking of the UK, and I was speaking at the UK with my sister also because she was talking about, I was talking about how they say frustrated out there, which they do. They're funny out there. But in fact, I've been speaking to a guy in London, at least emailing him from the TV show Paranormal Witness. So they asked if I could help them hook them up with some good cases. So hopefully they'll do that. And when they come out here, and if they get frustrated about something, you'll hear them say frustrated. But this is a mum. A mum had a report of a UFO. It was kind of funny because, side story with the Travel Channel producers, a lot of the producers of these cable shows are from the BBC and from the UK. And I did a Travel Channel thing on the paranormal not too long ago. And my mom wanted to go out with me to the forest, and so she did, where we did this filming. And she stayed in one spot, and they took me down, and then they brought me back. And I said, "Oh, there's me, Mom." And they chuckled. They thought that was funny. I love the British, and I love that the British are writing about UFOs. And this is, like I said, in their paper, the Norwich Evening News. And they're saying a mum, Vanda Jones, had seen a UFO. She just saw a strange light in the early hours of Sunday, and it looked very strange, and it flew in a strange manner. And then they also included that another gentleman out there actually also saw, in a different time, something weird flying around he thought was a UFO. So it's just kind of cool that their news is covering UFOs, but so does ours. Like we said, Valley Central covering Noe Torres. He's a good guy. I like that Noe. And then one last story, which is just kind of funny, is Spielberg's E.T.'s. He's an alien that makes him a bad turd, was the story. And this is from Robbie Graham. We had him on the show not too long ago, the Silver Screen Saucers. It was just a play on, Steven Spielberg trying to push the E.T. show, and they're like, oh, you got to make him evil. The Martians have to be evil and ugly, and, aliens are bad, right? And so he's having a hard time trying to tell them, no, this is a good alien. And they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Aliens are bad. So how can you have a good alien? And they call the poor little E.T. a turd, essentially, in the video. It is funny, and that's at Silver Screen Saucers. Finally, I just threw this in here because it's kind of fun, and this is a story from NASA about the space law, because more and more as we get into space and as commercial space becomes more and more popular, or in the commercial field, these groups like SpaceX and Bigelow and all of these guys flying into space, space law is becoming more important. So we don't really get to even see this in sci-fi movies, which is kind of funny. Closest thing is like the bureaucracy, I guess, in the Aliens movies. But how space law, you can be a lawyer that focuses in space law. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger, more important thing as they look into the legalities of, who owns what when you land into space. So that's kind of fun. If you're a kid looking for a career, that may be something you want to do, is be a space lawyer. And if you do this, here's what my suggestion would be. This would be fun and maybe would help you win business, is maybe wear a silver business suit. How cool would that be? You'd be like, people would be, what are you doing? You look silly. And you'd be like, no, I'm a space lawyer. And they'd be like, huh? You pull out your card and show, I'm working with NASA, space lawyer. What else am I going to wear? Duh. So that would be fun. Speaking of fun, it was a lot of fun speaking to our guest this week, and that is Scott Roberts. And let's have a listen. Well, I am happy to have caught up with a very busy man, Scott Roberts, who, among other things, is an author and the, would it be accurate to say, publisher of Intrepid magazine?
Yes. Yeah, that's about as accurate as it gets.
Great. Well, that's exciting. The magazine is beautiful. I mean, I love all your artwork everywhere that you've done for other projects as well. But it just looks great.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll get into how you came to the paranormal to start off, the beginning, your origin story, kind of like superheroes have their origin story. So how you became who you are. And I know you went to school for seminary and you got a master's in divinity, so it's kind of interesting that you moved on to, well, the artistic interests, but heavily into this paranormal realm.
Yeah, and let me correct one thing. I don't have my master's. I was working toward my master's in divinity.
Gotcha.
And I am one of those master's programs dropouts. So, the CD lot you'll find down on the corner hanging by the drugstore saying, hey, I worked 2 years toward my master's degree. Let's go steal a car. But I'm just making fun, obviously. But I did not finish my master's degree. I went to Bible college and did not finish Bible college, my bachelor's degree. And I was close enough, but I almost got expelled from school, believe it or not, back then. And it was we were in a very conservative fundamentalist Baptist setting. And one of the rules on the campus there was you were not allowed to have any physical contact with the opposite sex. Well, I got caught, quote unquote, kissing my fiance, and it was just a little peck on the lips in between classes, and I got so many demerits. They had a system of demerits at this school that it put me up 2 demerits away from being expelled. And I said, look, I'm going to withdraw rather than have expulsion on my record. And the president of the college even called me in his office, had tears in his eyes, tried to talk me out of, come on, you can make it through the rest of the semester, we'll help you and not get any more demerits. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And so I withdrew, and then the church where I was part of, the Minneapolis area, they founded a seminary, and which was a branch off of one of the bigger seminaries that had been around for about 30 years at that point. And so I started seminary there, and the dean of the seminary said, look, you come on board and we'll tutor you in the balance of your bachelor's degree, and you can start your master's program, Master in Divinity program. So I went to school there for 2 years and never did finish either degree. So technically, after how many years is that? 5 to 6 years of post-grad education, I have absolutely no degrees other than my high school degree. So,
I can completely sympathize. I mean, I've been in school for probably over a decade on and off, and some of those years very much on. And I'm just finishing up my bachelor's, so I could definitely cope or I understand.
And of course, now at age 51, I'm not prepared to go back to school full time. Although I've looked into it from time to time and thought, maybe I should finish off my psychology degree or something like that, but I just have not pursued it. Mm-hmm. And all of that to say, I even bring this up in the first book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. I say, look, you don't have to be a credentialed scholar to research and study and apply the same methodology as if you were a credentialed scholar. You don't have to have letters behind your name to pick up a book and read it. You don't have to have those credentials to go out and research. All that does is say that you put the time in and you've earned a certain degree. But I can tell you what, I know many people with earned degrees that some other people I knew have no degree could talk circles around or research circles around.
Right.
So it doesn't require that. It requires persistence and it requires the seeking of the information, which we're all capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, you can still apply the methodologies of science or research without a degree. And I think people would be surprised. There are a lot of very accomplished people, a lot of inventions or products or science that's been done by people who didn't have degrees.
Right, and don't get me wrong. I don't want anybody out there to think that I'm a proponent of not going to college or post-ed, and I'm not a proponent of that at all. I think wherever you have the ability, if you have the ability to go to school, you go to school and you do it. But what I'm insisting is that you don't have to have education to be knowledgeable about something.
Right. So you mentioned a couple of, or at least one of the topics you got into, because I'm not sure if this was the evolution which got you into the paranormal, but at some point you began to identify, or at least feel that some of these stories from the Bible could be explaining interactions with extraterrestrial species. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, it didn't even start as that. I'll tell you, I was very dichotomous as a young man. I was very spiritual and into my seminary training and into ministry. But at the same time, I had a great curiosity for the unknown, the paranormal, the ufological, the ancient alien. And you have to pardon me, I office at my home, and I'm out in the outside here, so you're going to hear a couple of vehicles going by. Sorry for the ambient noise. But I had a curiosity for things, and it didn't really morph into what it is now. Not for years, because it would start with just asking questions. Questions about who were the Nephilim, why does Elohim define as a plural in the Old Testament, names for God, things like that, and I'd have questions. And many times I got called or labeled the troublemaker, and that was, that came in one of two forms. Sometimes it was the, hey, you're a troublemaker, shut up, or we'll make sure you're not going to be around here anymore because we don't believe that here, and it was very serious. The other kind was, Scotty, you're a troublemaker, and it would be wink, wink, nudge, nudge from a professor who would say, I know there's more to it than that, but we just can't teach that here. So, and so that moniker seemed to follow me around, even though it was usually fairly lighthearted when it was thrown out. People were telling me, you ask too many questions. And I say, well, what's wrong with asking questions? I got questions about this stuff. And I was never reprimanded for it, but there were a couple of times that people didn't appreciate my questions, and other times I thought it was great. But that was what drove me. I had questions that just didn't seem to fit. And I believed one thing by faith, but then when I would find these questions and start looking into it, it didn't make sense for the things I was told I was supposed to be believing. Mm-hmm. And so I'd say religiously or systematic theology of the denomination we were in. It would sprout from statements like I would hear somebody say, we do it this way because that's what a good Baptist does. And I'd say, well, wait a minute, if I'm a Baptist first, which one comes first would be my question. And I'd get, you're a troublemaker. I said, no, I'm not. Aren't we all supposed to be Christians and emulate Christ, and this is what we teach? This is why we're studying the Bible. This is why we do all of this. It's to teach a better life, not to teach people how to be Baptists. And that was a point of contention for me. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many guys, many men and women have felt that in their own denominations, whatever they might be, or their own religions. And so that was what drove me to push the envelope a little bit, was to say, look, I'm not doing what I do and acting the way I act because I'm a Baptist. I'm doing it because I have a certain faith that I adhere to, and not a system of dogmatic theology or a grocery list of do's and don'ts that a denomination tells me I should or should not do. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that if I believe something that's supposed to be out of the Bible, that it's biblical in its content. And, we'd get into arguments in our church over whether or not somebody who was in church leadership, like a deacon or a teacher in Sunday school, should be able to drink alcohol. And they would base this on very loose verses about, not sitting long beside the wine until it is red, and, that means fermented wine. But the only problem was in the Greek in the New Testament. When they drank wine, the Greek word was oinos. When they were told to stay away from fermented wine, it was called oinos. And there was a big, huge, raging debate that went on for many churches for many years over what is oinos. Is oinos fermented wine or is oinos just grape juice? And I said, well, how many cultures define wine as being unfermented grape juice? They just don't. And this is the kind of argument that became church politics and denominational policy. It would override the faith issues sometimes. And I said, wait a minute. I started pushing back on this and pushing outward and saying, that is not what I want to be. And I have bigger questions than whether or not I should drink wine. And so I would ask those questions and start researching and studying them in other places. And that's a long rabbit trail-y story, but that is the kind of stuff goes on in church politics, church governance, methodology of church practice. And to me, in the time when I was there, I said, I thought church was supposed to be here to enrich the believers and to throw it out there to hopefully attract other people to want to come and believe the same thing, because of the what it's done for you and how it's enriched your heart and so on. Instead, we're arguing about stuff like this.
Right. I like the title of your magazine because obviously you were an intrepid person yourself. I mean, bravely kind of going somewhere and asking questions, which I agree with you. It's so important. And a lot of these things, and that's what I found when I went through a stage similar to what you're describing. I grew up as a Roman Catholic. I went through confirmation and all of that. But these same similar types of questions, and I started to realize that all of these were interpretations by some random people throughout the last few thousand years or hundreds of years. And just got to a similar place where arguing over all of these interpretations and getting watered down and losing the base of what I thought we were supposed to be looking at, which is kind of interesting because it seems like for me, it brought me to the place where some, people of religion have a difficult time understanding, to a place where I didn't let go of my spirituality, but I did let go of my religion. Which is a real and valid thing to do, I think. And is that kind of
I think so.
The evolution you went through also?
Yeah, very similar to that. You lose touch with the religion, which is, what is religion? Religion is simply the trappings that people put on a spiritual belief and start creating dogma, start creating systematic theology, and they create structure around something that was originally not structured. And by not structured, I mean a spiritual thought or a spiritual concept or a spiritual being. And then we start building our church governance or our religious governance around that. And once you start doing that, and there's no way to really avoid that unless you keep it all on an individual, personal basis. Mm-hmm. But if you start to have any kind of organized structure to pursue a set of beliefs with a group of people, you're going to have rules, and those rules are what creates religion. And I'm not anti-religious. I'm just, even Paul the Apostle, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, he said, work out your own religion with meekness and fear. Mm-hmm. He said, but he was also one of the greatest legalists I ever saw, setting down the law for Christianity, and this is what you do and what you don't do, how you act and how you shouldn't act. And I always found it very interesting that, like in the laws of that Paul laid down for the church, one of them included a whole series of things he wrote about women speaking in the church, how a woman should keep her head covered in the church, and if she has a question, she shouldn't speak in the church, but should ask her husband when she gets home, who will be able to answer the questions for her. Now, that to me sounded very Middle Eastern culture, ancient culture. That was a cultural thing. At the same time, you have Levitical law in the Old Testament, that said you couldn't eat shellfish or you couldn't come within 50 feet of a menstruating woman. Speaking to men there. And so when you have those laws and you say, well, there are some laws in our church that we disregard nowadays, saying they're not for today, but then there are other laws that we adhere to. which ones are which, and how are you supposed to decide which is the way to go? Because I said, I don't know any church I've been in where there weren't female teachers and Sunday school teachers and stuff like this. Yet the Bible tells us we're not supposed to have women speaking in the church. How do we get away with that? And, well, that's not for today. But then there'd be other things, other mandates in there that say, well, you know, and you could see where the argument went. It would get to be oppositional types of beliefs and picking and choosing what we're going to adhere to and not adhere to.
Right.
And that, to me, that's the definition of religion.
Right. And I guess for me, I was just a very curious person like you. I wasn't certainly out of maliciousness or an intent to tear things down, just the opposite. To understand better. I'm trying to understand my religion better, but I have all of these questions about these things said in here, and I guess just because of all of those questions, and being at the time, I would say, for me, a slave of the dogma, once I evolved and let go of that, and then you look at all of these words with a different lens, with an unfiltered lens, at least maybe just a filter of modern society and science and all of that kind of stuff, you see things differently. And it seems like that's kind of what you did. I mean, and you weren't alone in that. I mean, there's all the way back, there's a NASA scientist who is a systems engineer. You probably are aware of Blumrich in his book called The Spaceship of Ezekiel. And he looked at the Bible and is a NASA engineer and said, hey, this sounds like Ezekiel was seeing some kind of technology flying around. But you took a look and you saw a lot more than that.
Well, yeah, I did, because when I wrote The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, which was about a year ago that I was finishing up on that book, and it released February of this year. But that came out of many questions I had, and obviously outside stimulus that prompted me to start thinking in a different direction, seeing other theories out there and so on, because some of the theories we were taught just didn't make sense beyond a faith issue. And I find that faith, obviously, is that even the Bible defines faith. It says faith is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for. Or it might be the opposite from the way on those words. But in other words, it's that belief in something that we have no proof of. But it's evidenced by our hope, and I thought that's fine and that's great. But how can you apply faith to believe something that is contradictory to fact, or contradictory to history, or contradictory to archaeology or anthropology? And you can say, if I continue to believe this by faith, I've got to, in essence, either thumb my nose at science or ignore facts as they are presented to me. And so there's a reconciliation of those two. And that became a big quest of mine, reconciling faith and science. Can a scientist operate by faith? Yeah, they do all the time. You just take not creation, but you take the theory of the evolutionary ascendancy of mankind. You look at all the different stages. You can point out fossilized stages of what they call as the ascension of man, from primordial primate forms all the way up to present mankind. Now, the problem with any of that is they present it as fact when it is anything but fact. At least it's not established fact. It is proposed fact. It is probable fact, the way they state it. It is more than likely this is the way it happened by the looks of things. The problem is they have no evidence linking any of those stages of evolutionary ascendancy that they found in fossilized remains. None of them link. They just say they look like they probably do link. Well, looking like they probably do link doesn't make a fact. It makes an educated guess, a leap of faith, scientifically speaking, that these things are connected. And that's what I think science even does. On the most basic of theories, which would be the theory of evolution, we know that it looks like we've evolved, but we have no proof that we've evolved. Now, if you were to go to those same scientists and say, it looks like there are ghosts that exist, it looks like by all these mountains of photographic and recorded evidence that it looks like there's something else there, you will get laughed out of the room. and you will be told that you have some kind of intellectual deficiency. Because they say no matter how much it looks like, you still have not proved that it exists. And I want to say the same thing to scientists. You've only proven to me that you found fossilized remains. You haven't proven to me that any of them are linked. There's no DNA linkage. There is no historical linkage. There's no physical evidence linking any of them, yet you put it forward as if they are linked. That, to me, is the same thing. It's all educated guesswork, or it's all operating by faith, maybe with the scientist with a little more facts and figures behind it, but he's still operating on faith. That's the problem I see with a lot of what's going on out there. I saw it in the Christian side of things, or the church or religious side. I see it in the scientific and the skeptical side. Is nobody knows nothing, for sure. And which is, I think, a huge problem when you have so much dogma floating around out there. That's when there is a problem.
Yeah.
And I have, before, I just finished my follow-up to the Nephilim, the Secret History of the Reptilians. And in the end of the book, in the final words in the book, I put in a quite a long quote by Dr. Richard Feynman. He was an astrophysicist, a contemporary of Einstein and Oppenheimer, and he's now, of course, the late Richard Feynman. But he wrote this, and it actually wasn't written. This is stuff taken from a public speech he gave, so sometimes the text seems a little choppy, but it's because he's talking and it's being written down the way he spoke. But he said, if you expected science could give all the answers to the wonderful questions about what we are or where we're going or what the meaning of the universe is and so on, then I think you could easily become disillusioned and then look for some missed answer to these problems. The way I think of it is that we're exploring, we're trying to find out as much as we can about the world. And when we go to investigate it, we shouldn't pre-decide what it is we're trying to do. I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and differing degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. And there are many things I don't know anything about, but I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things, about being lost in a mysterious universe without having any purpose. That's the way it really is, as far as I can tell possible. And so altogether, I can't believe the special stories that have been made up about our special relationship to the universe at large, because they seem to be too simple, too connected, too local, too provincial. The earth. He came to the earth. One of the aspects of God came to the earth, mind you, and look at what's out there. It just isn't in proportion. Anyway, it's no use arguing it. I can't argue it. I'm just going to tell you that the scientific, well, at least the way my father's view showed me, we should look to see what's true and what may not be true. Once you start doubting, which for me is a fundamental part of my soul, to doubt and ask, and to doubt and ask, it just gets a little harder to believe. And that's what Richard Feynman had to say, a scientist. And saying, look, I don't have the answers to everything. And I don't need to know the answers to everything, but I'm striving to find answers to questions.
And that's a big root, I think, of the core of what he's saying, which I love. And I've got one of his books here, too, is... and one thing I appreciate about him, and there are some scientists still like this, it's okay not to know. And I've talked with other people in this field and mainstream media people, and they all say, really at the root of the ridicule or the not looking is people really have a problem with not knowing. They fear not knowing when, like him and like you, I think it's just wonderful to live in a world where you don't know because there's much more to explore.
And, it's interesting that there are biblical passages I learned as a kid that said, these things are written that you may know whom you believe and know what you're doing. And And I thought, that's great, but that's something I accept by faith. And what's interesting to me is that I've never seen God going out of his way to present his case. Now, the way we learned it in seminary, and the pet answer I had was, well, he did that 2,000 years ago. Doesn't the scripture say that God, who at various times spoke through prophets and miracles and deeds and wonders, has now spoken to us in the final form of revelation, his very Son, who he sent? And that's a scriptural passage, meaning the revelation is closed. God's done the ultimate. He's given himself, his Son. Yet now, 2,000 years after the fact, there's nothing new. What we have to go on for faith in those books is as crumbly and as old as the manuscripts we have that don't even date back to the originals. And at the same time, we have to put it through the filter of what did the language mean? What did the people to whom it was written understand when that story was told? And what did they understand about the nuance of their language and their stories that we don't know and will never know in the present age?
Right, and then along the way, of course, we have to rely on people telling us, here's how I interpret it, and here's how you have to believe it. And these, of course, are often not historians, just people who, let's say, 100 years ago decided, well, we need people to see it this way.
Yeah. And, and that is one of the big things I push in my books is think for yourself. Just because somebody taught you this doesn't mean it's so. And it doesn't mean you won't end up full circle at the same place believing the same thing. But don't just believe somebody because somebody told you that's what you should believe. Now, how do I know that person telling me that is credible? I can look into them. You got to do your research any way you look at it. I look at guys like I just wrote about in this book on the Reptilians about David Icke. David Icke is modern-day New Ageist. He puts forward a good message. There's nothing wrong with the message of wanting peace and brotherhood and down with the oppression of oppressive governments and so on. But when you wrap that in a message of there's a reptilian race from the constellation of Draco that is here operating behind the scenes, even behind what we would know as the Illuminati on our planet, and have been for millennium, trying to overthrow our race, and that every royal family of Europe, from the Habsburgs, to the whatevers and the whatevers, the Rothschilds, all the rich and wealthy families are all reptilians from the constellation of Draco, and all their descendants take on cloned human skin as a covering, and they're hiding in the stealth, and they're trying to overtake our world. And I'm like, dude, if they got the capability to do that physically, they could have overthrown us a long time ago before we even developed a thing called a gun. And but apparently this has been going on for millennia. And so his message to me is tainted by, if you want to preach peace and unity, more power to you. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you wrap it in this conspiracy theory, alien conspiracy theory, you lose my attention, because there is no way to quantify any of that, and there is no way to know for sure that any of that's real. And what I found in the writing of this book on the reptilians is that that's just modern versions of ancient mythology. So mythology repeats itself over and over and over again. And it may evolve a bit. It may take on new characters. It may rest for a while and somebody else picks it up and it starts up in a different form. But when I start comparing current-day conspiratorial alien mythology to ancient mythology of gods who came down, you're really talking about the same thing. And I saw this is very interesting, it was very timely. I had already finished the book and turned it in, but the other night I saw the show with Morgan Freeman on the Science Channel, Through the Wormhole. And they were talking about the power of belief psychologically to make us do things. And Morgan Freeman always starts off with these little vignettes that are reenacted with actors kind of silent while he's narrating about when he was a child and this happened. And he talked about, I think it was his grandfather dying, and the preacher is saying he's gone on to a better place and we're all going to go join him someday, and God is good and all of this. And he said, I had a hard time reconciling as a child that God was good and yet would not let my grandfather live. And he says, now, of course, we have lots of answers for that as adults. And but as a child, he says, that began my train of thinking that God is maybe not so interested in me as I thought, or in us, or, he said, that started setting the course for the way I believed. And they went through all these scientists that were conducting these experiments on we act certain ways and do certain things, and our subconscious or unconscious response to things is based on stimulus that is either sometimes presenting the invisible character to be feared that loves us, like God, or having no structure like that at all. And he found in all these different tests, they conducted one test to say the power of suggesting that there's something invisible there. This guy had a bunch of adults in a room, and he passed around a fountain pen that was in a box, and he said, you can handle this if you want. He says, this was Einstein's fountain pen. And people are looking at it, they're opening it up, and they're looking at it, handling it, oohing and awing over it. The next item he passed around the room was a sweater in a box. And he said, now this is a sweater that belonged to the very infamous serial killer and cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer. And he passed it around the room, and he's talking about it, and some people wouldn't touch the sweater, others would just pass the box on, others wouldn't even touch the box, and they recoiled at it. And now, when he was all done with his experiment, he said, I'm going to tell you a secret. That's not Einstein's pen, and that's not Jeffrey Dahmer's sweater. He says, but watching your responses to it is what this experiment was all about. All I had to do was tell you that was the pen of some great man, and you all wanted to handle it. And all I had to do was tell you that was a sweater worn by somebody who ate people and killed them, to have you recoil from the object itself, the inanimate object. And, of course, he was establishing the case that the brain, that's the way we're physiologically wired, to recoil from sometimes the imaginary, just because the power of suggestion is there. And I find that very interesting with religion and the way that we learn about God without coming fully short of saying God doesn't exist. Let's say God is exactly who the Bible says he is. Let's say that is God and he's there and that's all true. We don't see that. We don't experience it. We only know about it. And that's what governs the way we act. And I'll give you a great personal example of that. In writing these books, I have come to there was at one point where there's a real crisis of faith for me because all of this stuff flew in the face of the things that I thought I believed or had always believed. And my wife and I were sitting and watching a show on some channel. Just, we do most of our television watching after 11 at night. We go to bed and the TV's on and I got the laptop or a book and the TV's going. And we caught some show on a guy that had left the Amish community. And he helps other people, and by the time the show was filmed, it's one of those reality shows, and he'd been out of the Amish for about 10 years. And he helped other kids that wanted to break out of the Amish and out of that way of life. And he didn't have anything, he wasn't against the Amish and looking to shut them down or pull people out of them. He was just helping kids that wanted to adjust to a life outside. And he said, I have a wonderful life here outside. He said, I have a wonderful job and a house and my wife and my family. And he says, there's times I miss my family in the Amish. He says, I'm shunned from them and they don't talk to me very often. And he says, but every night, he says, when I sit down in the quiet, he says, I think to myself and I pray about it. He says, I'm going to hell because I have left the faith. And my wife hits me on the shoulder. And I said, what? And she just points at the TV and she said, see? And I said, what? She said, you are that guy. And she was right. There's no matter how far you depart from something that's been ingrained in your psyche, and no matter how much sense something might make, you still have those old tendrils of that fearful, invisible, angry God that will cast you into a lake of fire because you've done wrong.
It's funny because it reminds me, and I think this was true of a lot of people, my generation and friends also, is that, and maybe even of the singer, but the Nine Inch Nails song, and maybe Trent Reznor was going through the same thing, but it was an anthem for me at the time because I was coping with exactly what you're talking about, the whole God is dead, if there is a hell, I'll see you there. Which is funny because it's kind of this I don't believe in this stuff, but on the same time saying, yes, I do, because I'm acknowledging hell, and I'm going to see you there.
And, of course, if you go by a scriptural definition of hell, you'll never see anybody else there. It's just a place of eternal separation from anything, from the love of God, lake of fire, and all the descriptions put on it. And I had gotten to a point where I started asking the question, if God is so infinite in his wisdom, why did he leave it up to the finite minds of human beings who live maybe only 70 to 100 years if they live a full lifespan, a natural lifespan, to decide whether or not they're going to a place as horrible and terrible as hell based only on the writings in an old text that's over 2,000 years old? Mm-hmm. I thought, if God is vital and living and alive, as we were taught in our church, and so caring of humanity, why would he leave it up to simple faith to avoid going to such a horrible place for all of infinity? And I never quite understood that about the nature of God.
Well, and I think this conversation is really important also because of this field. I mean, you brought up David Icke, and I won't name names, but, I mean, there's a lot of this. I think you can come, and I was telling, me and a friend were talking about this recently, is that if you know there's a group of people with a certain worldview that's highly controversial and based on faith, and you acknowledge and reinforce that worldview by some fantastic tale, whether or not it's true, whether it's something you dreamed, and maybe it's something you experienced in a dream or in an altered state and you believe it was real, and so 'cause many of these stories are usually non-physical type of things.
Right.
You're going to have a big following of people who are going to want to come to hear what you have to say because you're reinforcing this belief, and then they're among people who get to talk about why they believe this thing that they just believe on faith, whether it's religious or extraterrestrial or anything else. You know, people really flock and they create these very tight bonds amongst each other.
Yes.
And then you get these communities of people supporting each other, and then you have some people take advantage of that and then ask these people for a lot of money.
Absolutely.
And they literally live off of feeding this kind of monster that's been created. It's something I think we have to look out for, because sometimes it's malicious, maybe sometimes it's not, but still, like you're talking about, I think if you're searching for truth, or at least you're searching for
right,
you've got to be careful about that.
Absolutely. And, you know, there are lots of situations I've been on. I always believed in local church fundraising. You know, that's a local congregation, and I've always been okay with that. But I found that it's like I have the same questions I ask about government sometimes, but I understand both sides of this issue. It's that why should we spend so much governmentally on this, and this issue while we still have people starving in our country and so on? Now, that might be I'm fairly conservative in my political views. And a conservative would tell me, oh, you're thinking very liberally there, Scott. And I'm like, no, you know, because I look at people down the street from me who might have a much harder time than I have. And I'm by no means in that wealthy bracket. But I say, why is our government spending money on this when it could take and funnel that money into that? Why is it rescuing a auto industry when it could take that same money and distribute it to people who need it to buy food, things like that? Now, of course, there's all kinds of arguments in that. I understand. I'm taking a very generalized view here. And I would do the same with a church. I'd say, why are we building a gymnasium for our social activities at this church when we should be sinking that money? If we really believe the message, we should be sinking all of that money to build a gymnasium. You know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why aren't we giving that to missionaries or to people doing work out in the bush or setting up a radio station? You know, why don't we, while we donate to those, we give them $50 a month out of our church budget. And so why don't we give the $100,000 into the gymnasium to them to build a radio station so they can promulgate the word over there? Those were the questions I had when I was at church, and especially in some of these big fortress churches I was part of. And they were all good-hearted things. But I think those are the questions that would come to me to say, Christianity, even denominational Christianity, denominational religion, it focuses on its local congregations, and I get that. Our church was doing those things for community outreach, and I understood that. There's always a justification for it. But you're right, when religion starts to take on that tone of somebody that might be taking advantage of the people, where you've got the sad stories of, elderly giving away their whole fortunes to churches on TV or on the radio or whatever. And that's just, a church should not accept that kind of gift. It should be wiser than that and smarter than that, if they are truly spiritual-minded. Mm-hmm. And, that's a totally different topic. It has nothing to do with the topic of the books and so on. But these are issues that led me, all of this stuff we're talking about is the kind of thinking that led me to say, there's something different here. There's got to be something more. And I remember this musical we put on in our church, and I played the part of a man who was a Pharisee during the time of Christ. And it was a musical. It was very well written. It had a almost Les Miserables kind of feel about it, some of the music composed for this thing. But he sings a song about there must be something greater than the temple, something firmer than the law. And he's seeking for something. There's got to be something more. And that's really where I found myself getting with religion, was there has to be more to this than this. And why, if I'm finding these passages in Scripture that seem to say this, why are we contradicting that in our faith when it says it here? I need to dig into this more. And the more I dug, the more I found different things. And the more I've become very fond lately of saying the universe used to be a very small place for me because it was all governed by God, who was the benevolent ruler over all, and the loving God, and so on, until that eggshell that surrounded that started cracking and chipping away, and you saw, wait a minute, there's a whole world out there that is unexplored and undefined. And you say, I think God is either much bigger than we give him credit for being in biblical religion, or God doesn't exist the same way we thought he did, or God doesn't exist at all and it's something else. And I haven't come to the latter yet, but that pathway starts because you start thinking, and you think, and you think, and you try to analyze, and you say, this doesn't make sense. These things that I read, for instance, something I was going to bring up. You look at the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt, and you've got all these Israelite slaves that Moses goes to the Pharaoh, according to the biblical accounts, and let my people go. And Pharaoh keeps telling him no. And, who am I to listen to you? And so God brings these 10 plagues on Egypt. And then finally, after the death of the firstborn of everybody, Pharaoh loses his own firstborn son, and he sends them all away. I don't want to ever see your face again. And they go heading off, and they end up at the Red Sea. And then Pharaoh, in the meantime, is going, what have I just done? I've given away our whole slave task force. We're going to go after him. He mounts the armies and chariots, and they go after them. And, of course, what happens? We all know the story. We all watched Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments. God parts the waters of the Red Sea and opens it up for dry land, and this million-plus family of Israelites crosses through. And then what happens? Pharaoh chases them through, and then God closes the waters and drowns Pharaoh's armies, and the people are saved. Then they go to Mount Sinai. A couple of weeks later, they're at Mount Sinai. While Moses is up there getting the tablets, what do the people do? I know, we'll make a golden calf. That will be our God who delivered us. And, of course, Moses had great anger and all of this. And all through the 40 years they wandered as a nomadic tribe in the wilderness, this was repeated over and over and over again. And I thought, for a minute, I stepped back and I said, wait a minute. If I had just seen the acts of someone that I was told was a god bringing 10 plagues on Egypt, parting the Red Sea in front of my eyes, and I'm crossing through walls of water onto the right and the left, and I see it closed up, engulfing the army that's going to destroy me, and I see all these miraculous deeds, would I build a calf out of gold and say, that's my God? So I started to wonder, who wrote the book? Moses wrote the book. And I thought, no, sure, it's been edited time and time again. There's been lots of scribal entries, but how would a people who experienced these things firsthand be able to turn their back on God or not accept that God was the real God when he performed all these deeds for them? And I got to thinking that in my book on the Nephilim, I call the chapter on Moses, I'm establishing him as the writer of the book and bringing certain things about the Nephilim to the book of Genesis. And I say Moses was nothing more than the Pharaoh god of Israel, that he was somebody who was raised from young childhood all the way up till he was 40 years old, being groomed for a pharaohship of Egypt. And he learned his education in the courts, the royal courts of Egypt, and the schooling and the thought and the religion of 18th dynasty Egypt. And then he murders a taskmaster, a slave taskmaster, and runs for his life. And I thought, there has to be more to that. Why did somebody who was of the house of Pharaoh, in line for the pharaohship, being groomed for that, murdering a man who is one step above a slave, why is he running for his life? And I thought, there's more to this story than the author, Moses, the guy running for his life, has told us. Mm-hmm. And then 40 years later, of course, the burning bush experience after he goes to Midian, marries the daughter of the high priest of Midian, a heathen, an infidel, a religious infidel. He marries his daughter, and he becomes a very important man in the sheep herding business out there in Midian. Then he meets God in a burning bush. Nobody else saw that except him. And he reports that, and he goes back to get his people out of Egypt. And we know the story from there. And there's other events that took place during the time that Moses was there. And it was very interesting that Moses, there's one point when they were in the wilderness, it said Moses would pitch his tent outside the camp. And the pillar, the pillar of fire that led them by night and the pillar of cloud by day, which has been described by ancient alienists and ufologists as nothing more than probably UFOs of some source, that this cloud would descend on his tent. And God would come and speak to Moses in his tent, face to face, as a man talks to his friend, Moses writes. But then 9 verses later in the same chapter, Moses writes, and no man can see God's face and live. Now, did he just contradict himself in the same chapter? Just a few phrases down the road? Or was that deliberate? What was Moses doing? He was doing what a pharaoh does. A pharaoh of Egypt was considered to, once he took the pharaohship, he was a brother to the gods. He was no longer fully human. What was Moses saying when he said, I see God face to face, but no man can see God's face and live? The subtext there is, I'm more than human. Mm-hmm. I'm at one with God. And so here is Moses establishing himself as the brother to the God, or part of the Godhead. And that was actually the big sin. He was told by God he would never enter the land after this 40 years, the promised land, because he kept equating himself with God. So Moses, the great lawgiver, the founder of Judaism, the man who brought the law, was also a man who was doing this as someone who learned how to be a brother of the gods. And that is what he brought to Israel, which made me wonder, did he create Judaism? Or did God really write on those tablets? Did God pass this all down? Did God perform miracles? Or were those miracles exaggerations that Moses wrote about? Because he wrote the book himself. Now, that dismantles faith in order to do that, obviously. But you see a man who has a very different color to him when you look at the subtext of the passages and you look at where he came from and what he was trying to accomplish. It's like Muhammad when he founded Islam.
I want to get back, though, to actually your books on the Nephilim and the reptilians. Even though, you're looking into this and researching and you're throwing out, you're questioning a lot of, such as the biblical text, There was some of it, though, that you felt, this is true, that indicated that the Nephilim were stories of real beings. And what led you to that belief?
Well, I went back to the biblical passage because, obviously that's where my education was. But the word Nephilim is something that has been used over and over again, even in pop culture of ancient alien mythology. And so I went back to the origin point of the word. And the word Nephilim is found in the book of Genesis. It says, "And in those days the sons of God came down to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old and the men of renown." And I always wondered who these beings were. I used to ask in seminary, who are these guys? Who are these sons of God that came down and impregnated human women? And the answer I was given was usually something, well, we all know that it's only humans. It was just the sons of the aristocrats who ran the schools of the prophets. And they went down and, in a sense, were slumming with the common women down in the valley. So they went down to them, and that the offspring were the heroes of old and the men of renown. And they called them the Nephilim, the giants in the earth. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense, because you taught us in systematic theology that language means something. And in the Hebrew, the sons of God were differentiated from the daughters of men, who they came down to. You have the sons of God being the Bnei Ha-Elohim versus the daughters of Adam, the daughters of mankind. And there was a stark contrast made. And so when I saw this, I started questioning and digging a little more. And the reason it had come up was I had heard the theories that these sons of God were nothing more than simply the Hebrew version of events that took place, of much grander, greater human events, interruption in the human course of history, of human development, and so on. And so I started looking into that more, and I wanted to get a biblical definition of it first in order to spread out from there into comparative religions and then other mythologies or other points of view on this. And so as I was looking into this, I had to define who these sons of God were to start with. And I came up with the Hebrew term. In the Hebrew, it says in that passage in Genesis 6, they are the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of Elohim. And Elohim is one of the names for God that's used in the Old Testament. As you know, if you know anything about the Old Testament, there were many names used for God. Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, the angel of the Lord, Jehovah, all these different names for God. And yet the one used the most in the Old Testament was the word Elohim. Now, Elohim, by definition, means God among many gods. And I used to ask in seminary, what does that mean? Is that a plurality? Well, that's obviously standing for the Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I said, well, why doesn't it say Trinity in there? Why doesn't it call it? And furthermore, the Jews, the Hebrews, believe in a Trinity. So how could that be the Trinity? Well, it's the foreknowledge of God out of the Trinity. These are the excuses I was given, just like the one that the Nephilim were humans, or the sons of God were humans. And so I dug into that a little bit more, and I found out Elohim, the definition of the word means God among or of or amongst many gods. El being the Hebrew name for God, and Him, just like in the word Nephilim, Him is a suffix that denotes plurality. So Elohim just simply meant God of or among or amongst many gods. And it was a word, however, that could be used both plurally or singularly, depending on the context. And so the context, it'd be like our English word for the word deer. I see a deer, singular, in my front yard. I see a herd of deer, plural, in my backyard. It's used like that, kind of. And so I started looking into this a little more, and it's the God among many gods. I saw Christian and Hebrew scholars alike, rabbinic scholars, saying that this was the just simply the singular God with a multiplicity of powers and majesties. Like you would hear a monarch say, we are bringing this decree to our people, and so on and so forth. And so I thought that didn't quite cut it, because there were passages where you saw the singular Elohim speaking to the plural Elohim. Psalm 82 was a passage that said, and Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim, and he, singular, said to them, plural, you are all Elohim, plural, the bright, shining princes of heaven. And so I brought that back to the Bene Ha-Elohim. I said, now wait a minute, the Elohim, this is and I found many other sources in the Bible and writings about the Bible, the Elohim were a cast of gods. This was the pantheon of the Old Testament. And when you hear that the Bible teaches monotheism, one godism, it's wrong. That's not what the Bible teaches, especially with the Elohim. And you take the Elohim, and it says the Elohim were the ones who came down and impregnated the daughters of men, the sons of Elohim, the Bene Ha-Elohim. Then you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden story, where you see the first of the Elohim. And it doesn't come out in a casual reading of the English text. And by the way, I'm going somewhere with all this, so this all ties into this ancient alien theory. You go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 3, and look at the story of the Garden of Eden and the serpent who tempts Eve. Alejandro, let me give you a pop quiz. Who were we taught was the serpent in the garden?
The devil. Satan, I guess.
The devil, Satan, Lucifer. However, do 99% of the people out there know that neither the word Lucifer nor Satan nor the devil appears anywhere in the Genesis text? Nor does it appear for thousands of years later. What you have in the Genesis text is the word Nakash for serpent. And Nakash, by definition, means this. It means crafty magician, and crafty just meant craft with the hands, able to manipulate and so on. The crafty magician. It meant bringer of illumination and knowledge, the bright, shining one, the illuminated one. Now you compare that to the bright, shining princes of heaven in Psalm 82, and the Bene Ha-Elohim, the bright, shining ones who came down and impregnated human women. You have Nakash, right at the creation story of mankind in the Hebrew Bible, that says, and the serpent, Nakash, the serpent character, interacted with Eve. And the language there is implicit. It's not talking about the eating of forbidden fruit. It's all sexual in nature. That Nakash seduced Eve, that Eve metaphorically saw the fruit, that it was good, and ate of it, and also gave to Adam, her husband. This was a sexual act. It was the bringing of a certain kind of knowledge that did not exist. It was the forbidden knowledge of the gods. And right after that, in the Genesis 3 passage, you have this verse that says, and God said, the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are become like us, like the Elohim. Let us now prevent them from also eating of the tree of life, lest they live forever like us. And so a couple of questions were raised in my mind when I saw that. Was, first of all, what did God have against knowledge? And people having knowledge, humankind having knowledge. That seems to be the great sin that took place. Then secondly, what kind of being was God that man could be like him if he ate of this certain fruit or did this certain thing or followed through with this metaphoric eating of these fruits of these certain trees? If man could be like God and God wanted to prevent that from happening, what did that mean? Who was God then, if mankind could be just like him? That told me something, especially when he's speaking in the plurality. And this is all borne out in the Hebrew Old Testament. All the genealogies, all the prophecies of the Messiah, all of this stuff are all piggyback stories, or stories on which they piggyback the story of race interrupted, a race that had created a dual bloodline had been conceived. Because according to the Genesis story, pardon me, I got my kids worshiping at my feet. According to the Genesis story, the Messiah was first prophesied at the Garden of Eden story. And according to the Genesis story, there was a bloodline that was interrupted. According to the Genesis story, Eve bore twin sons, Cain and Abel, but one was the son of Nakash and one was the son of Adam. Cain being the son of Nakash, Abel being the son of Adam. And right there at the cursing in Genesis 3, after the fall of mankind, God utters the first, what is considered in rabbinic schools and Christian schools to be the first messianic prophecy. And that's the words that God says, and there will be a day when you will crush his heel, but he will return and crush your head. It's a prophecy of the coming Messiah. In the Jewish sense of the word, Messiah meant kinsman redeemer, the redeemer that would come from one of us, be of our blood. And God prophesies there would be a kinsman redeemer. At the same time, he says, and there will be constant enmity or conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, meaning the seed of Nakash and the seed of Adam and Eve, and that they would be constantly at conflict with each other. And what did this mean? When you start looking at the whole picture and story of the Old Testament, you see repeated over and over and over again that the Messiah would be one of us, that he would come from the pure human bloodline. When you get to Noah and the Ark story, which takes place right after the story of the Nephilim, which, by the way, the whole story of the sons of God coming down and impregnating human women, bequeathing the Nephilim, is the preamble to the flood story of Noah and the Ark. The flood picks up 2 verses later in that same chapter. And it says that Noah was a man who was righteous, and God was going, and he chose Noah because the rest of the world and all of humanity was corrupt and wicked. Well, when you read it in the Hebrew, it says, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, bequeathed of the sons of God, mingling with human women, and God saw that humankind was corrupted, the bloodline was corrupted, and he was going to destroy it by flood, and he chose not the one righteous man, but in the Hebrew, the one man who was pure-blooded and who was pure in all his generations to Adam. And there was a reason for that. The story of the Messiah is the story that the Hebrews put in place, whether it's true or not, it's the story that's in place that piggybacked the story of race interrupted, because it kept telling you there was an impure bloodline versus a pure bloodline through the whole Old Testament. And it's interesting in the genealogies, when I look at King David, when I look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, they trace their lineages back to Adam, but they don't go through the firstborn traditionally, which is Cain. They go through the thirdborn, Seth, because Abel had been murdered. Cain was the murderer and was exiled from Eden. Is that the reason they don't trace through his bloodline? No. It's because Cain's bloodline was not the pure human bloodline from which the Messiah could come. It was the tainted Nephilim bloodline of the Elohim, whichever Elohim figure it was that came down and impregnated Eve. And then Seth, the thirdborn son to Adam and Eve, was the one that carried on the pure human bloodline. So they trace Jesus' bloodline through Mary, the Christians do, back to King David and back to Adam through Seth. The Jews trace David back to Adam through Seth, not through Cain. And all of this starts establishing a big picture of an impure human bloodline, or a human bloodline that was tainted or interrupted by something else. Now this is where you start drifting off into other theories or other cultures. There are over 600 different ancient cultures that have flood myths. Connected to all these flood myths in almost all of these stories is the common thread of spirit beings or non-human beings that came down and impregnated human women, and some god, deity, or higher superior power of some kind wipes out the rest of the planet because he's wiping out this impure hybrid race. And this is common to many, many stories out there in ancient cultures, over 600 of them. And when you start having this taking place, you step back. If you're Jewish or if you're Christian, and this is your source point for these things, these stories, Step back out of that for a second. Take a step out of the box and look at the whole picture. What have you got? You've got the Hebrew version of the story. You've got the Sumerian version of the story. You've got the Chinese version of the story. You've got every other culture and tribal religion had its version of these stories with different characters, different names, different courses of events, but all with the same facts going on, the same common threads. And what does that tell you? Is one of them truer than the other? Or do they all represent a common thread and a common story, a common event that took place to humanity? I look at simple stories such as the Tuatha De Danann of the Celtic people. The ancient Celts were visited by the bright, shining, elegant kings that came from heaven. Again, the bright, shining reference. And they came down and spread the forbidden knowledges of the gods. And eventually there were wars that went on, and they receded into the hollow hills and became known as the elven folk. Think of Tolkien and his definition of elves, and you've got a pretty good handle on that Tolkien had his thumb on the pulse of what was going on, more than just making up story. The elven folk, also a derivative of the word El, or Elohim, El for God in the Hebrew. You've got Quetzalcoatl of the Mayans, the winged feathered, or the feathered serpent, who came down and disseminated knowledge of the forbidden knowledges of the gods to the human beings and was condemned by the other gods for it. You have Krishna of the Hindu religion, who sat beneath the banyan tree in a beautiful garden on a coiled serpent and disseminated the forbidden knowledges of the gods to humans and was executed for it by the other gods. You have all these stories that keep repeating themselves in different cultures. So that begs the one big question. And even though my source point is the ancient Hebrew Bible, because that's where you get the source of the word Nephilim, the big question is this, is what really happened there that every culture has their version of this story? Mm-hmm. And then you can dig into, which I did more in the reptilian book, you start digging into the Sumerian culture. And the Sumerian culture, if Moses indeed wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, gave us the story of the Nephilim, he would have written that in or around 1400 B.C. is the date that he would have done that. And you go back about 2,000 to 3,000 years earlier, between anywhere from 2500 B.C. to 4800 B.C., you have the beginnings to the end and the remnants of the Sumerian culture. Their caste of gods, which has become over-popularized in books like from Zecharia Sitchin and all this ancient alien theory, the Anunnaki, the Anunna. And the Anunnaki were the pantheon of gods that ruled over the people of ancient Sumeria. Their chief god was a god named, now start seeing the similarities already, 3,000 years earlier, their chief god was Enlil. And Enlil was tired of doing all their own labor, the gods, and so they had Enki, also known as Ea in the neighboring Akkadian culture. Enki, Ea, was given the task of creating primeval man to do our labor for us. As a matter of fact, I have it sitting right here in front of me. This is a modern translation of the story from the cuneiform tablets of the Sumerian culture. And it says this. This is translated to English right from these old cuneiform texts, about 4,500 years old. While the Anunnaki are sitting before you, and while Belet Ili, the womb goddess, is present, call up one and cast him for destruction. And then they go into all this different poetry on all of this stuff. And it says, let's see, I'm going to go on and find the actual point. And Belet Ili is drafted, so to speak, by Enki to create humans. And it says, and they called up the goddess and asked in the midwife of the gods, wise Mami, M-A-M-I, you are the womb goddess, to be the creator of mankind. Create primeval man that he may bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man bear the load of the gods. And it goes on from there. And you've got the creation of mankind, of primeval humans, to do the work for the gods. And so Enki creates them. But along the way, Enki sees the distress and the abuse of the humans that he helped create as a slave race. And according to this story in the cuneiform texts, he goes and helps lead them in a rebellion against the gods. And I think I've got it right here, somewhere right in here. And it's in the Atrahasis texts of the cuneiform texts, the story of Atrahasis the king, where Enki comes to him. And far-sighted Enki and wise Memi went into the room, and the womb goddess was assembled, and so on. And he talks about all these things. And he goes into Atrahasis, and he says to him, now there was one Atrahasis whose ear was open to his god Enki. He would speak with his god, and his god would speak with him. Atrahasis made his voice heard and spoke to his lord. How long will the gods make us suffer? Will they make us suffer forever? Enki made his voice heard and spoke to his servant. Call the elders, the senior men. Start an uprising in your own house. Let heralds proclaim. Let them make a loud noise in the land. Do not revere your gods. Do not pray to your goddesses, but search out the door of Namtara. Bring a baked loaf into his presence. Bring the flour offering. Reach him. May he be shamed by the presence and wipe away his hand. And Atrahasis took the order, and he gathered the elders to his door. And Atrahasis made his voice heard, and he shares all the words of Enki. And they start an uprising against the gods. This is right out of the cuneiform texts.
Right. Now, in interest of time, because this is all really interesting, but we're pretty much running out of time. Because I think there's more stories, a lot more. I mean, if you get into the Greek gods and mythology, all very similar, like what you're saying about these gods who actually act like men, power hungry and greedy, and then hatred, and creating humankind. Then that could be an origin story for humanity. And thus, do you think, I guess getting to modern times, do you believe that our origins come from some sort of hybrid programs with extraterrestrials, and do you then feel that we're still we're living this out somehow? We're still being visited and still interacting with these?
Well, I will tell you this. The point I make in my book, Reptilians, to cut it very succinctly, is that there may be something to ancient mythology, but then again, it may just be mythology. Mm-hmm. And we don't know for sure. We're never going to know exactly for sure unless we have that personal experience. And I believe ancient mythology has affected modern mythology or has given birth to modern mythology. Mm-hmm. And do I think that there are aliens out there? Do I think, as we would refer to them? Yeah, of course. I believe that we have had interactions with ancient aliens. I believe we have interactions today. I believe the people that we call crackpots and nutcases, because they've had their experiences, are people who have had experiences we have not had. We cannot write them off simply because we think they're a crackpot. Mm-hmm. And we don't agree with their story, or that just doesn't happen. So, yes, I believe that this stuff happens still today. I believe that there is interaction. I believe that aliens exist. Can I prove it? No. Do I prove it with my books? Absolutely not. What I do prove, though, is that the things that we sometimes hold fast and dear to may just simply be a version of the mythology. And mythology can simply be the stories and the legends that have risen up out of actual things that happened. Mm-hmm. And I have said, and this is nothing new to you or any of your listeners, but perhaps ancient mankind, when he saw non-human entities, be they alien beings or however you want to define them, non-human entities, that they placed on them the monikers of God, goddess, devil, demon, angel, and so on, when in actuality they were nothing of the sort. So it's like a coin toss, or I will say, for the benefit of my Dungeons and Dragons friends out there and gaming friends, it's not a coin toss. It's a roll of a 32-sided die. Mm-hmm. And which one of these is it going to end up on? Which is the truth or the fact of the matter? We don't know. The only fact we have is that ancient mythology has bequeathed modern mythology.
I think that's a really interesting concept there, too, is that this rebirth and rediscovery of this ancient mythology, yet, like you're saying, has created and spawned and morphed into a modern mythology, and that's really interesting.
Well, it's very interesting when in this book I dug into things like the Merovingians. We've heard about the Merovingians and the Grail, the Holy Grail, the Arthurian legends, and how very popularized in Dan Brown's the Da Vinci Code and the movie is that whole base, the whole foundation of that book and that movie is the Merovingian, the Merovingian dynasties, who during the 400s and to the 700s ruled in what is now France, Gallic Europe. And they claimed that they were descendants of the blood descendants of the bloodline of Christ, the Grail bloodline, as we learned about in the Da Vinci Code, in a fictional book. But this is all built on some of these facts that these kings put forward in order to control the masses around them. Mm-hmm. But at the same time as saying they were claiming to be of the bloodline of Christ, they also made claims that they were of the Cainite line, or the line of Cain, a Luciferian bloodline, as they defined it even back then in the 400s. And so they had a mixed lineage of Christ, the blood of Christ, and the blood of Lucifer, which spawned, even before that, but it even spawned, it proliferated, is the better word, proliferated the notion that Jesus, the Christ, and Lucifer were indeed either one and the same person, or they were brother Elohim. That is one of the theories out there. And it could be blasphemous and sacrilegious and heretical if you're part of the church. But if you look at it and try to decipher it and say, is this a possibility? Were they two beings from the same thing? That is what the Merovingian bloodline was built on. Mm-hmm. The Merovingians and that Grail bloodline is supposedly the bloodline of the Nephilim, as brought on by Cain. And that is brought all the way up into, I bring it up into Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was part of a society called the Thule Society in 1919. And they were Germanic socialists on the outside, pushing nationalism. And yet on the inside of this organization, they all believed in an Atlantean bloodline, that spirits of the Nephilim and spirits of the Atlanteans were giving them special powers and pointing out who was the Aryan race and who was not. And Hitler brought these ideas into his establishment of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. And then, of course, his final solution and so on. Right. And I find guys like David Icke in current day, while he will claim he is not an anti-Semite, has strongly stood against the Jews or pointed out that the Jews are part of this Cainite bloodline. And so there's an anti-Semitism about David Icke that is very distasteful.
Right, and that part does get really scary. But
it certainly does.
We are out of time, I'm sorry to say. Very, very interesting stuff. I think you've definitely piqued the interest of a lot of people. They can go to ScottAllenRoberts.com, and there are links to all of your books, or they can also go to IntrepidMag.com to see more about your magazine. Is there anything else, any other URLs you wanted to point out to people? Yeah,
if they go to Intrepid Mag, they'll see a link to the Paradigm Symposium, or you can just go to ParadigmSymposium.com. If all this stuff is intriguing to you, we have a huge symposium up here in Minneapolis taking place October 18th through the 21st. We have Eric von Daniken as one of our main speakers, who wrote Chariots of the Gods 40 years ago and 30 books since then. We have George Norrie from Coast to Coast. We have Giorgio Tsoukalis, Bill Burns, and Philip Coppens from the show Ancient Aliens of the History Channel. Ian Punnett will be there from Weekend Coast to Coast, and about a dozen other authors and pundits in this field. So if you this kind of thing gets you jazzed and makes you thinking, we're going to have that symposium coming up in October. Go check it out. Get your tickets now. They're moving fast. But here's where you can sit under these people. There's never going to be a gathering quite like this again. It's being hailed as the event of a lifetime in ancient alien and ufological fields.
All right. Sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Alejandro.
Thank you, Mr. Scott Roberts. So remember, intrepidmag.com. Also, thank you for being a listener today. And, of course, as usual, UFODailyNews.com for all of the news that I talked about earlier, where you can also join the Twitter feed or anything else going on social networky there. My whole right hand, the page is all my social network stuff. So if you want to keep up to date, go check that out. But Scott Roberts, that was a lot of fun. Be sure to join me next week for more excitement and good stuff. And until then, you just have a lovely time, and I look forward to talking to you all again soon. Adios, muchachos.